All right, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. All right, I'm here today to introduce Aaron Gross, who founded Farm Forward in 2006 as an organization entirely devoted to ending factory farming and creating humane, sustainable, and just alternatives to it. He collaborated heavily with Jonathan Safran on Foyer's best-selling Eating Animals in 2009. Foyer also spoke at Google, I believe, about a year or two ago, so you may remember that talk. He's currently working with Jonathan and Natalie Portman and director Christopher Quinn to transform the book into a feature-length documentary. Gross serves as Farm Forward CEO and is professor of theology and religious studies at the University of San Diego. He recently published Animals and the Human Imagination, a companion to animal studies. And just so you know, there will be time at the end of the talk for questions, so please save your questions for then, and we appreciate you all coming. Without further ado, help me welcome Aaron Gross.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's really good to be here and really good to talk about these issues, and nice to have a good crowd like this. So my name is Aaron Gross. As Chris was telling you, I started this organization called Farm Forward about 5 years ago. And there's two big things that Farm Forward works on. One is we try to work on the kind of supply side end of the problem of factory farming, changing what's available, working with producers to try to create more humane and sustainable farms. And there our work really centers on the poultry industry. And I'm gonna, in most of this talk, center on the poultry industry for reasons that will become clear. The other end of our work is consumer focused. And that's really, in some ways, what I'm doing right now. Doing educational outreach in a whole variety of ways to get people more knowledgeable about what this thing is we call factory farming and how we can respond to it. Because we really live in a world that's changed radically in a very short period of time when it comes to food. I mean, we're getting used to very rapid change. Certainly in this building, you've got to be. But with farming, there's a lot of important knowledge that in a previous generation might have been passed on to us through our parents, through grandparents, and today what our parents and grandparents might know about farming is just irrelevant to what's going on. It really changes that quickly, and so I'm going to try to fill some of those gaps. I have to say I had a bit of fun with my title, Robot Chickens and Virtual Farms. Probably was such a serious topic, I shouldn't have so much fun. But really each one of the kind of images here, that is the image of the robot chicken, the image of the virtual farm, the image of pink slime, really does help kind of set up what I want to do. We do, I think, live in the age of pink slime. That is the pink slime controversy. People familiar with pink slime controversy? For those who aren't, it's this kind of, it looks like kind of pink soft serve ice cream, but it's actually a beef product. And it's kind of seen as pretty disgusting by consumers. It's not really the problem I want to focus on, but this was a big recent controversy. And ABC showed that this pink slime stuff wasn't just kind of occasionally used here and there, but in about 70% of the ground beef in supermarkets, there was this substance, pink slime. And why I think this is kind of an image of the age is it was there all along for more than a decade, and we didn't know it, even though it was something with us every day. And that really is the kind of situation we're facing in trying to understand factory farming. And we don't have cybernetic chickens yet, that is true, but we do have transgenic chickens, chickens that have a human created gene snipped from a virus and inserted into a chicken. That's already a done deal. Those same scientists who are in Edinburgh at the Roslin Institute, that's where Dolly the sheep was created, are now working on putting a mouse gene into a chicken. So the image of a cybernetic chicken isn't actually that far off from what we're actually doing. Chickens may not come to mind when we think high tech, but chickens are pretty high tech today. And what I mean by the virtual farm is this. In a certain sense, all of us here are farmers. We're virtual farmers. What we decide to eat, the decisions we make, go through a chain and tell farmers what they're going to make. And we really have tremendous influence that way. Wendell Berry, an interesting person in the broader movement of kind of reflecting on food. He's kind of the quintessential farmer intellectual. He has this famous statement, or famous within foodie circles, which is we're all farmers by proxy. And I think it's a powerful idea. What we choose to eat ends up dictating what gets farmed. So with that as an introduction, I want to kind of have one little piece to kind of complicate the social justice issues and so forth associated with food, which is that when we talk about food, we're never talking about a simple issue. We're never talking about just the environmental issues that might be affected by it, or just the animal protection issues that might be connected with it, or just the social justice issues. We're also talking about something that's really close to our identity, that we think kind of tells us who we are, how we choose to eat. It's a very personal statement. To kind of drive this home, I want to share with you two small excerpts from the book, Eating Animals, by Jonathan Safran Foer. That book begins and ends with a chapter named Storytelling. Both the opening and the closing chapter have the same title. And I've got a small quote I want to share with you from each one. So in the opening section, Jonathan includes a monologue from his grandmother who was a Holocaust survivor. And the clip I have here is Jonathan's grandmother speaking and then them in conversation. And I'll just read this. So this is grandmother speaking. Then it all changed. During the war, it was hell on earth. I was always running day and night because the Germans were always right behind me. If you stopped, you died. There was never enough food. I became sicker and sicker from not eating. And I'm not just talking about being skin and bones. I had sores all over my body. It became difficult to move. The worst it got was near the end. A lot of people died right at the end, and I didn't know if I could make it another day. A farmer, a Russian, God bless him, he saw my condition, and he went into his house and came out with a piece of meat for me. And then Jonathan interjects, he saved your life. Grandma, I didn't eat it. You didn't eat it. It was pork. I wouldn't eat pork. Why? What do you mean, why? What, because it was kosher? Of course. But not even to save your life? If nothing matters, there's nothing to save. Something really ultimate was at stake for Jonathan's grandmother here. Something about food cuts to a deeper level. Now at the end of the book, Jonathan revisits this story. He ends up kind of sharing a little story that comes out of history books about Abraham Lincoln. While returning to Washington from Springfield, Abraham Lincoln forced his entire party to stop to help some small birds he saw in distress. When chided by the others, he responded quite plainly, I could not have slept tonight if I had left those poor creatures on the ground and not restored them to their mother. He did not make a case for the moral value of the birds. Instead, he observed quite simply that once those suffering birds came into his view, a moral burden had been assumed. He could not be himself if he walked away. Whether I sit at the global table with my family or with my conscience, to accept the factory farm feels inhuman. To accept the factory farm would make me less myself, less my grandmother's grandson, less my son's father. This is what my grandmother meant when she said, if nothing matters, there's nothing to save. This is a complicating factor with food we don't have with a lot of other social justice causes, and something I want to have us keep in mind. Now, food matters so much. I imagine if you're here, it's already because you have some sense that food is important, but I think the scale of it always needs to be emphasized. So I've got 5 points I want to begin with here, just to give you a sense of how important this issue is, just how much we shape our world in the choices we eat. The number one cause of global warming, the number one contributor of global warming related gases is animal agriculture. This has now been well documented in 2 studies, one initiated by the UN, another initiated by the Pew Commission. Those are not, lightweight bodies when they do research. So if we care about global warming, we gotta care a lot about animal agriculture, about the way in which we raise and eat animals, because that is the biggest cause. Not as something obviously good or bad, but just gives you a sense of the magnitude. A third of the surface area of the planet, excluding kind of frozen tundra and that sort of area, a third of the planet on which human beings can walk is occupied either by animals grazing or by the farms that have to feed those animals that are grazing. A third of the surface area of the planet occupied by this single activity, not producing food, but just producing animal food. We can also talk about this, and we do less of this for whatever reason publicly, but we can talk about this problem not just in relation to land animals, but in relation to sea animals. The industry that produces seafood has undergone the same kind of radical transformation that we've seen in animal agriculture. Really a lot of actually military technologies applied to fishing, to catch fish in areas they weren't able to do before, at depths human beings were never able to reach, and so forth. And we now actually have a situation where we're hauling so much biomass out of the oceans, we can actually measure a decline in the overall kind of vibrance and health of ocean ecosystems. Now think about what I'm saying here. We're not talking about like a particular gulf near a human area or a particular route which salmon follow. I'm talking about the whole of the oceans, all of it as a whole. There's a statistic called Marine Trophic Index, MTI. It took about 20 years to develop, but it's a way scientists have that allow them to actually get a snapshot of the global ocean. And they can actually watch a process of kind of reducing food webs by eliminating certain kind of top-level predators, and so we end up with basically a lot of jellyfish or a lot of algae instead of a diverse range of species, and less of them. So we're actually emptying the oceans. In other words, if we were just to stay where we are right now and continue, the end of that curve would be a completely kind of empty ocean. Really an amazing thing to think about. It used to be, we thought there's no way we can have an impact on the oceans, but indeed we can. And farming is also related to global inequity. I'm not going to focus on this right here, but I have one statistic worth pondering. By 2050, the world's livestock will consume as much food as 4 billion people. You can do the kind of math and think about how this will work in terms of when you have conflicted resources around water or land, or even food itself, how that's going to become an increasing issue. We have a situation right now where the poor compete with wealthy people's livestock for grains. And that is only going to become a more serious situation as we move into the future. And finally, the source of what we call, superbugs or superpathogen, these things you hear about referred to as bird flu and swine flu and so forth, with scientists really worried about it becoming a serious pandemic. This is primarily driven by the kind of animal agriculture we have. I mean, very simply, I'll flesh this out a little bit later, but very simply, we've got about 50 billion chickens being raised for meat on the planet. These are chickens which are kept in circumstances such that their health is compromised, and they're constantly being fed drugs because that's the way the system works to make them productive. So you've got 50 billion sick animals being fed antibiotics. That creates a perfect situation for viruses to emerge that are going to be able to survive this, or new bacteria to emerge that aren't going to be able to respond to antibiotics. So we've got this perfect kind of recipe for creating new pathogens. And this is really worrying scientists quite a bit. To give you a sense why, I was, just the other month, I had the interesting privilege of going to the Roslin Institute in Edinburgh. This is where Dolly the sheep was created, mentioned it a second ago, because of the transgenic chicken. And I was speaking with one of the virologists there, and this is somebody not interested in farm or food issues, but he's working on transgenic chickens. He developed a transgenic chicken because he's so worried about what could happen with H5N1. That's the bird flu virus that folks are most worried about. Viruses all have these H's and N's to classify them. So when we say H5N1, we're talking about a particular kind of lineage, of a virus. And that lineage, this is why it worries folks, because when human beings have gotten that virus, about 60% of them die. That's a very high death rate. To give you a sense of how high that is, in 1918, we had the biggest natural disaster in human history. 20 to 50 million people, they estimate, died. The US was bulldozing mass graves. It's really an amazing thing. We don't hear too much about it. But that pandemic, they estimate, had a 2% fatality rate. So we're dealing with something that currently has, if that virus doesn't decrease in its virulence, a 60% death rate. Now what that virus hasn't yet done is mutate in a form which allows it to be easily transmitted. So it's very deadly, but we don't worry about it because at the moment it can't be easily transmitted. But birds and pigs and humans, we all share receptors that allow us to be susceptible to viruses. And so when birds can get sick by something or pigs can get sick by something, it's a relatively small step for humans to get sick by something. So we pay careful attention to this. And the scientists are looking at it and they're saying, we've got this virus which appears to about to be adapting to a form where it can spread quickly in the human population, and it would be the most deadly virus we've ever seen. And we know that the situation of the factory farm helps create these viruses. So we're dealing with a very important topic, one that will shape us in profound ways going into the future. Now what I want to kind of do here in the center of the talk is tell you a short history of factory farming. How did we get to where we are today with this industry I keep telling you is so radically different than other kind of farming industries we had before? Well, my story is going to start in the 1920s in Delmarva. Delmarva is Delaware, Maryland, Virginia kind of area, and this is where the poultry industry has really grown up. And in somewhere around 1926, there was a Ocean View housewife, a woman named Celia Steel. And like many housewives at the time, she had a small flock of chickens. Actually, at this time in the US history, we had an estimated 26 million poultry farms. 26 million poultry farms, but each one only had 20, 30, 40 birds. And this was the way America produced its poultry and its eggs, by lots of very small scale producers. So Celia Steel was one of them, and she placed an order for chicks, for baby chicks, and there was, this is a legend, a mistake. She ordered 50 chicks, about what she could deal with, but she got 500. So she had all these extra birds that she wasn't able to sell. And so she experimented with actually trying to keep the birds alive indoors during the winter, when they wouldn't survive outdoors, and actually, keep them healthy and fat enough that they would be saleable at the end. Now, had she tried this at any other point in history, she would have failed. We know it wouldn't have worked. But at that particular moment, we had some new knowledge. We knew a little bit more about how nutrition worked. So she knew to add vitamin A and vitamin D to the animal's feed that made them a bit healthier. And very quickly, she had access to drugs that could deal with the diseases that were cropping up by keeping the animals inside. So what she was able to do is kind of figure out a way to put birds inside, which caused a lot of health problems, but then counteract those health problems by manipulating the feed and ultimately by putting drugs into the feed. And she was very successful. So at a time when the average poultry farm is 20-some birds, her farm very quickly had 10,000. And in that area, that county, today, there's still 250 million chickens produced. In terms of county specific, that's the largest county for producing broiler chickens. So the rest of the country is looking around at this incredibly productive farm and say, this is great. This is the way of the future. We're going to put birds indoors, and it's going to be more efficient. We can do it in all seasons. And it started to grow. Now, as it started to grow, the industry became interested in intensifying this process and creating kind of a loop that made it go faster and faster. So after this basic idea of putting birds inside and then giving them specialized feed had been developed, they went after the genetics. That's really what drives the poultry industry, is the genetics. Once you have a certain set of genetics in place, you have to raise the animal in a certain set of circumstances that fit the animal's genetic makeup. And so they wanted to breed a chicken that would be really profitable in this kind of circumstance. And unlike previous generations, which had to deal with chickens being able to survive in diverse kinds of weather because they were outdoors, this new generation of chickens could be bred with the notion that they could control their environment and various other kinds of things. And so they were able to come up with a new chicken. The government actually held a Chicken of Tomorrow contest in the 1940s that helped lead to this. And it was amazing in some ways what they were able to do. They've now taken the chicken and they've created a bird that can grow 3 times as fast. 3 times as fast. That is, it'll reach market weight in 35 to 40 days instead of something more like 120 days like it would have been in the 1920s. And not only will it reach market weight in 1/3 the time, while it's growing, it will eat 1/3 less feed. So this is kind of like a 5-year-old that looks like they're 15 but has only ever eaten breakfast. Now, from the point of view of efficiency, this looks really great. But you can imagine there's going to be some cost to an animal if you push its immune system that hard. And indeed, there is. These are very sick animals. These are really, in some ways, mutant animals. They all share, for example, what we call colloquially an obese gene. They have a particular genetic marker. We actually have the gene coded. We know what it is. And that seems to be the kind of key factor in creating this rapid growth. But what it also means is that the bird's flesh, the bird's meat, its fat and so forth, grow faster than its bones are capable of growing. So you've got a situation where the animal is constantly breaking its bones or unable to walk. Pretty serious problem. It means that for about the last 1/3 of their lives, even though these birds are only a month and a half old, about the last 1/3 of their lives, it's painful for them to move, just to walk. And so as a result, they don't walk very much. But it turns out they're not walking very much as profitable because they don't burn as many calories and they build more fat. So we created a situation where we have to use drugs, where we have to use confinement because this genetics won't work. We put these birds out on pasture, we just deal with very, very high mortality rates. So a lot of our free-range farms are dealing with like 30, 40, 50% mortality rates because they're using these factory genetics and just responding to this market demand to put birds outside. But if we don't change the birds' genetics and we just put them outside, it's just a lot of suffering. Now, you and I may be looking at this situation and saying, this sounds awful. Like, why would you want to do farming in this way? But the industry looked at this situation and said, this is great. And as the ag industry looked at this and said, this is the way farming should be. Look at the way this system works. The genetics of these birds end up being controlled by a few corporations. That's actually a story worth pausing on a bit. Let me explain how that happened. It used to be that farmers who had chickens could just breed chickens together and get more chickens, right? Wouldn't you have thought that was still the case? You could just breed your chickens together and get more chickens, just like somebody can breed their golden retrievers together and get more golden retrievers. It doesn't work that way anymore with chickens. Because in the process of creating that new chicken, in the process of moving from the chicken that we've had with us throughout history to the chicken we now have with us today, they changed the breeding techniques rather radically. This is why I would say the chicken is essentially a genetically engineered bird, even though it doesn't fit that definition as commonly defined. So here's what happened. Normally what you could do is take chickens from two different lines. Let's say this line is especially fast growing and this line is especially good at laying eggs. And if I bred those two birds together, a mother from here, a father from here, I'd get what they call hybrid vigor. That is, the first generation of birds born from a cross shows some increased productivity. But here was the problem. The birds that came from that cross, if I was the farmer and I bred those together, those gains wouldn't be sustained over time. So I could cross birds once, get a little boon, but then it wouldn't be sustainable. You couldn't have this kind of hybrid thing be a permanent situation in the old way of doing things. But what the companies figured out is they could actually find ways to make all birds hybrids by doing the following. So it used to be I had my small flock of birds, but now if you want to breed birds, you have to have at least around 2 million birds. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to preserve parent line, grandparent, and grandparent lines. And each line I have is going to take about 100,000 birds. And then I'm going to breed them together in a kind of cocktail fashion. And then it's only the end resulting bird, the result of somewhere between 10 and 20 crosses, that I'm going to sell to the consumer. And that bird is just completely useless as far as breeding is concerned. It'll have a really big breast, have a lot of fat on it, or it will lay a lot of eggs depending on what I want to do. But if I try to breed the offspring together, just completely unviable. So this was fantastic from the point of view of corporations. As long as they could control these big farms, control the genetics, they could own everything, so vertical integration started moving. They had reduced the cost, and in general, that increases market share. And so the other industries started following suit. I'm not going to go through anywhere near the kind of detail I just did with poultry, but it's basically the same story. First, the pork industry jumps on board and starts to ask what it can do, then the dairy industry. The beef industry is the last. The beef industry is still, to a large extent, removed from the factory system in the early part of beef cow's life. In the latter half, it ends up being in a pretty kind of factory setting. But poultry became the model. It drove the whole thing. And I think that's important to know, because if we want to change it, poultry is kind of the hardest nut to crack. It's the biggest problem that we have out there. So one of the things that happened in the course of this breeding is we ended up with two different types of chicken. We ended up with what's called layers, birds that are specialized in laying eggs but absolutely useless for meat production, and another set called broilers. This was a new thing. It used to be birds were always kind of dual production. You'd get a certain number of eggs if you were a meat farmer. That would be side income. Now it's completely specialized. At the egg end, we've made the bird produce twice as many eggs as it produced pre-1950, and with similar consequences. The stress on the system weakens the immune system and creates this kind of cycle where you then need to control the animal's environment and feed it drugs in order to make it productive. So I want to show you a few things we're doing kind of in response to this situation, because we've kind of all grown up with this situation, not being quite aware that it was unique for chicken to be as cheap as it is today. We actually eat more than 100 times per capita as much chicken as we did in the 1920s. 100 times. I mean, it's really hard to believe this, but I've looked at the primary sources and the data. It's really true. It was only in the 90s that chicken became the most consumed food. So we've got this exciting thing going on. How many people here are familiar with the book Eating Animals? I imagine some of you that brought you here. So Eating Animals is a book very important to my organization by Jonathan Safran IV. It really kind of captures the ethos of what I'd like to see kind of happen, and certainly the ethos of what we're doing here at Farm Forward. And it's really exciting to report to you it's now being made into a documentary, and an amazing lineup of folks are behind this. Jonathan is the author. Natalie Portman ended up being the kind of key person who really pushed this into the realm of being a documentary film. And as it turns out, this is kind of hot off the presses news, but Biz Stone and Evan Williams have agreed to finance the film. So they're putting about $1.25 million into making this film happen. So over the next 2 years, this film is going to be produced. Filming has just started. It's going to be about a year of filming, a year of editing. And I want to show you some of the scouting that we've done to give you a sense, kind of fill in with some images, some of the things I've talked about. So what you're seeing right here is actually an egg factory farm. This is what an egg farm looks like in the contemporary day. This is Christopher Quinn, the director I mentioned doing the shooting. What he's standing in front of here is chicken shit. This is just a vast lagoon of chicken waste. It actually, it's kind of pretty here with the farm reflecting in the cesspool. It's pretty disturbing, but this is what rural landscape begins to look like with factory farming. You'll notice you don't see any animals. They're there. You just aren't going to see them. This last shot is an empty egg factory farm. I don't include any shots in case you're wondering of animals actually suffering on factory farms. I think it's really important to see, but sometimes it's a little bit overwhelming. So I do encourage folks to look at that. But being inside that empty egg factory farm was an interesting experience. Those cages you saw end up being split into cages about this long, in which it's basically about the size of a folded newspaper, in which 5 to 6 birds would be raised. That particular one was abandoned because the factory farmer who owned it went on hard economic times and just stopped feeding his animals. So it was seized by the state, which had to then kill the animals that were remaining in there, and it ended up being a good place to do some filming. So that's the problem we're fighting. But there's some good grounds for being hopeful. So this gentleman here is Frank Reese, and he's in some ways the last traditional poultry farmer we have in the country. This is Christopher filming Frank working with his birds when they're first hatched, coming out of the hatcheries. This is still a kind of high-tech operation in certain ways. This part of the operation looks the same, that is the birth of the birds. But after the birds are born, it's night and day. These are his turkeys out in the field. And these birds, roam around all day. They fly, they spend time in trees. They basically do the kinds of things you thought birds would do, as opposed to industrial turkeys, which aren't even capable of sexual reproduction. This bird right here, it's actually a wild turkey. I'm not kidding you. This wild turkey joined the flock of Frank's turkeys. It's a good life. They have a good life. I mean, I personally wish they didn't have to be killed at the end, but at least they have a really good life here. Here are some of the chickens. Now, these birds are so unusual that you're seeing because these are pre-industrial genetics. This is one of the things we're working on that really very few, in some sense no other really big players are working on, is actually trying to get these traditional genetics back in the market. To kind of recognize that road we went down when we introduced the fat gene and intensified the bird's growth rate so that it would grow 3 times as fast, that forced us into a situation where we need to use drugs, where we need to use confinement, because otherwise we deal with such rapid death rates. We need to reverse that situation. It's very hard. We're kind of locked in as far as the big industry is concerned in using these fast-growing birds. But what we're trying to do at Farm Forward is work with folks like Frank to try to create an alternative model. A model that can be profitable, that can deliver a product people feel really good about, and that can eventually challenge the industry. Because what we see right now is there's just not a model in the poultry industry. In the pork industry, in the beef industry, I can point you to small producers which are doing truly extraordinary things entirely outside of the factory system. But if you have in your mind a poultry producer maybe a poultry producer whom you buy eggs or meat from at the farmer's market or that kind of thing, probably that farmer is in the end getting their chicks from the same factory hatcheries with the same factory genetics that other folks are. We don't have alternatives in the poultry industry the way we have in other industries. So working with Frank is a way to create that. And our aim is to create a model. Frank, bless his heart, is willing to share all his economic data and what it takes him to be successful. And we're working on basically producing a model that can be repeated and that can be duplicated. So one of the other things we're doing, I mentioned, is education. And here's where technology starts to end up entering in an interesting kind of way. So one of the things we've done is try to bring Jonathan Safran 4 into classrooms. We found that if you have a kind of live interaction, you get a lot more, a lot more emotional impact. But how do you do that on a large scale? How do you reach young people on a large scale? So we're getting very excited about using video conference technology to provide at very low cost. We spend a few $1,000s, and then we can provide a live kind of experience where students in high schools and small classrooms that otherwise couldn't interact with Jonathan an opportunity to interact with him live. So I'm just going to play here a minute or so of Jonathan just from October 3rd. So this is just earlier this month. Jonathan speaking to about 3,000 students.
I am at the New York Video Conference Center, which is in Midtown Manhattan, just a couple blocks from Times Square, and I came here this morning from my house in Brooklyn. There are many things I could have done with my day today. I have 2 little kids. I could have played with them. I could have worked on my writing novel. But I really wanted to be here. I'm very happy to be here. I wanted to be here because I believe strongly in the issues we're going to talk about. I believe very, very strongly in this form of communication, something that's direct, something that's conversational. I prefer it, actually, to writing books. What I would prefer even more would be to join you in the classrooms, have a genuinely personal conversation, a real-time conversation. That's the best, obviously, that we'll be able to do. And finally, I'm happy to be here because I like talking to younger people, students, grade school, high school, and college, are more able and more open to change than older people are. This has been very well demonstrated. So when thinking about factory farming as a problem, and when thinking about the solution to the problem, which will not be huge amounts of money, and will not be going to war with another country, and will not be electing new governments, it will not even be finding new values, but simply changing as individuals, changing our daily habits. I, of course, am most excited to talk to people most able to change.
So we got tremendous feedback. As you can see, this is, low tech. This is him off the cuff. That conversational style really worked. We just got incredible feedback from teachers. This is something we're going to do again next year. Now, another thing we're doing, and this is really more of a serious use of technology, is we're looking for a tool that's going to allow consumers to make smarter choices around poultry. And what we've come up with is the idea of a program we're calling buyingpoultry.com. And the idea is not to promote the buying of poultry, but to educate consumers so they can make choices about what poultry they want to buy if they want to buy it. Simple kind of idea here is to have a mobile app that looks something like this. We're working with a wonderful firm, BLT and Associates, which is a Hollywood marketing firm that really help us kind of have impact in a way we can't as a small organization. So this is kind of a partnership between us and a much bigger gun. And the idea is that you'll have something very simple. You open it up, it's going to geolocate, it'll know where you are, tell you what's available in that area in terms of poultry, but it's going to have some kind of system that's going to help you understand what's going on. So it's going to help you learn about sustainable poultry. It's going to have easy to access information. It's going to tell you what certifications actually mean. It's going to provide some real commentary, not just technical information, give you a sense what are the kind of labels and buzzwords, which probably don't mean anything in terms of your own values, and which ones really do. It'll have things like national top 10 lists, worst 10 lists, ways that will help create competition among businesses to do this. It'll also allow a consumer to immediately be in the supermarket. There isn't the chicken they want to buy. There isn't that faux chicken they want to buy. They can, with one click, send an email. It will know what building they're in and be able to do it. And we've worked out the kind of back end of this. We're in the process of doing the fundraising for it. We've got a Kickstarter campaign that's going to be kicked off. And of course, the web version will just simply be a little bit more robust.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Safran 4, coming to you from my home in Brooklyn, and I wanted to talk to you a bit about buyingpoultry.com. People ask me all the time what they should be eating, and I always return their question with a question, which is, what do you care about? The food choices that we make have very serious repercussions in the world, not just for the animal we're eating or not eating, but for an entire food system. The farm industry is famously secretive. It can be very complicated to buy food because we are bombarded with different kinds of labels, different stamps of approval. So what can you do? Sign up on this page that can connect good farmers with consumers. You will know where to buy food that is cage-free, free-range, natural, organic, and perhaps more importantly, you'll know what those terms actually mean. It's a project that's in development, but in the meantime, you can offer your input, you can receive updates, and when it ultimately goes live, be among the first to have it.
So these are some of the ways we're trying to think about to reach consumers in new ways, to change the culture. And that's in some ways the most important work. But as I mentioned, we're also working on the production end. And I just want to share one thing we have recently been able to accomplish there. What we found out is there's a bit of a problem with getting investment in these kinds of high welfare operations, but not because there isn't demand. That is, pretty much everybody who's looking at investing in something like a higher welfare poultry operation knows there's a whole bunch of people out there who will pay quite a bit more to have a product that's produced according to their values. You might be sitting here thinking, I'd pay another $1 per pound for chicken if it met my values, and you may be some of those people. That market is there. But here's the thing, there's this kind of scary situation where even if somebody produces a product that really does fit your values, they don't have a vehicle for protecting its integrity. They don't have a way of communicating to the consumer, hey, we're different. It's too easy for another corporation to come up right now and kind of steal the language and appear to be like that other company. That's where buying poultry became very important. We realized unless there was a tool that allowed consumers to discriminate, you couldn't get investment in these new operations to make these kinds of high welfare products available. Now, in the interim, while we're kind of in this place where we don't have good certifications, we don't have good labels, where it's easy to confuse the consumer, we still need to be building that alternative infrastructure. We don't really want to waste any time. Especially true because what happens in the US, even if it's on a really small scale in poultry farming, if we change just a few poultry farms, get a few things happening differently, that can have a massive impact globally because of what's going on in India and China, who have not, like us, factorized their whole production process. There's still a lot of stuff there that can be transformed. So I'm very excited about changes here, even if they're at a relatively small scale. And so we created a loan program that's directly for farmers. And the money comes from animal protection groups. This is pretty unprecedented, to have animal protection groups actually supporting people who are involved in the killing of animals. And that's a bit of an uncomfortable relationship, and some people think that's just a bad idea all told. But what it's enabled is, what it is enabling, is the truly high welfare producers to get a slight edge that allows them to get off the ground. We are talking about a loan program. They have to pay it back, and that shows that this is a real economic model. This is part of what I was saying in terms of demonstrating a model's viability. If you can't demonstrate it, if you can't get a loan to begin with. So we've solved that problem by bringing in some nonprofit interests to put together, in this case, $150,000 to fund a barn for Frank Reese, the farmer I showed you before, who actually has wild turkeys joining his flock. What you see in the background there looks from a distance not all that different from a factory farm barn, like those ones you saw next to the cesspool. But on the inside, it looks completely different. It just has a bunch of roosts, and it's really where the birds will go in the evening. Birds are natural roosters. They like to go in and be protected in the evening. But during the day, the barn doors open and the birds are out on the field. But this barn has a lot of high-tech features that would otherwise have been very hard for Frank to invest in. We've got automated feed for water, and automated feeders and automated water, and fans and various devices that help control the temperature in the building. So basically taking advantage of high-tech solutions that help and that create better welfare, but not going that route of using those genetics that force us into using confinement and drugs and all of this kind of thing. And we'll see. We're right in the midst of this experience. This barn just opened a month ago. If the model is successful, if it can pay the loan back, as I'm very certain it's going to, we'll then have another another tool in our shed. We can really bring that data out to the public. And in the meantime, of course, there's people forging relationships between consumers and these special producers, and that's an exciting thing in and of itself. Now, I added this little piece at the end. I'm calling this kind of part 2 because it's kind of an add-on. What I've given you so far is kind of my usual stick, but I'm sitting here, I'm coming to Google, and I couldn't help think, like, what if, this is my little personal fantasy, not something I think is going to actually be a strategy, but I'm like, if Google decided it wanted to fight factory farming, what would it do? And I actually think if Google wanted to, it's a company in a perfect position to end factory farming. And I think we can do it in 3 steps. And it begins with asking a simple question. If we have technology that can make, say, every road in the country visible, why not consider using similar kind of technology to make every farm visible? I realize a little bit more of a technical accomplishment, but we're in the realm of kind of thought experiments here. You see, the thing is, the factory farm industry depends entirely in its business model in a very serious way on secrecy. It depends on that. It's very, very serious about protecting that. You may have heard something about what we call ag-gag legislation, that is special legislation which makes it illegal to do, makes it more illegal to do things that are basic investigative techniques that have allowed various investigators to uncover things that happen on factory farms and bring it to public view. That's really the main channel right now of bringing information to folks like us about what goes on in factory farms. And so threatening is this information to companies. They've actually gotten together and supported legislation that does things like make it illegal to take photographs of animals on a farm. Now you'd be thinking, don't I have free speech rights that protect that? And you do, but the time in which they passed the law and the years in which it's going through the court system and so forth will all be years where investigations don't take place because the investigators are scared of the kind of draconian possible consequences that are there. So they're introducing a bunch of things which probably won't pass constitutional muster, but which you should be very worried about nonetheless, because the industry is expanding this strategy. They were in a few states last year, but 15 states in this coming legislative session. They're going to be introducing this kind of legislation. Point being, this industry is so concerned about secrecy that it will publicly support anti-free speech legislation. It's incredibly unpopular, you can imagine. Folks do not like an industry trying to pass legislation that hides it, but it's worth their while because so dangerous is transparency to this industry. So what if, Google offered to put cameras on every farm? This is actually happening in slaughterhouse auditing. They're doing remote auditing through cameras. It's probably what will be the way in which slaughterhouses are audited in the future. So this is not a complete science fiction scenario. If it is to somewhat, I think if you pretty much do it, it's going to go like this. If there was push in that direction, some kind of push towards providing that technology, activist groups can put plenty of pressure on farms in various ways to go transparent, including by passing ballot initiatives. We have a movement that's organized enough to pass legislation at the state level. So you can imagine them pushing for transparency. There's a vehicle for it. They can't complain that it's costing them money. I think very much what would happen as soon as those video cameras got installed, a very simple economic cycle would start where people would see this farm, they'd see that farm, and they'd make their choice very clearly. And I genuinely believe that would be enough to end factory farming. I don't know if it's going to happen that way, but it could. And that is what I wanted to share with you guys. I'm hoping we can have a bit of a conversation here. Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you for the talk. I saw Jonathan's talk here. I subsequently read his book. Loved it. Think what you're doing about raising awareness is fantastic. And as a person who's been vegetarian basically 25 years or vegan my whole adult life, I generally support anything that's going to better the condition of animals. But I look at it, I guess, a little bit skeptically, and I say that just in a friendly way. Please. Because I'm definitely sympathetic. But so let's say factory farming ends tomorrow. Let's say the industry adopts all of your standards or Frank Reese's standards tomorrow, right? So you already said at the beginning of the presentation, a third of the land on Earth is devoted to raising animals. So if they adopt this, then that means more land needs to go towards eating animals. Why don't you just tell people to be vegetarian or vegan and help them make those choices. Because if you, and I'm not advocating factory farming, but you can't scale what you're doing.
Yeah, so
people have to eat less meat. I mean, it's just a simple equation.
Yeah,
so
no, you're absolutely correct. So the question is, why not just promote like no meat, less meat? And tell me your name?
Brian.
Brian is absolutely correct that there's no way around eating less meat as a population. And one way to accomplish that is a lot more vegetarians and vegans. There's really no scenario whether factory farming stays with us or not. So that's absolutely correct. And I do encourage people to be vegetarian. I would encourage people to go vegan. There's very few ways you can have as much impact on animals and the environment than simply just by removing them from your diet entirely, because it's extremely hard to find the really good producers. So that is something I would advocate. But what we see is that meat eating is very entrenched. It's probably not going to go anywhere, no matter how much the vegetarian movement grows, and it is growing, and I think it will continue to. And so what I focused on today really was about how to make a future in which meat is still there, but has to be a smaller part of the plate possible.
Fair enough, and I think that makes sense. I mean, I would pose sort of a counter argument, which is that I see around. I live in San Francisco, and a lot of my friends, they hear, "Oh, you're vegan, or you're vegetarian. Oh, I buy my eggs here. I'm really careful," and stuff like that. And then we're out late night in the Mission at a taqueria, and they're having beef tacos. And guess what? Like that taqueria in the Mission isn't buying free range beef. And so what I've seen is that it becomes almost more of an excuse for people to kind of go on with their existing habits of eating meat, because they're lured into this sense of, oh yeah, I'm making a conscious choice and I've thought about it or whatever, but they're really kind of not. And in a sense, the people who are the most receptive to change, like people like us, people who are affluent, people who are well-educated, people who are open-minded and willing to make the change, are kind of siphoned off when they have options like this.
So this is, you're presenting a very serious argument that we've thought a lot about. And what I would say is I'm sympathetic to what you're saying. I mean, I am making a bet on a different strategy. My observation is that vegetarianism and lower meat or higher ethical meat diets rise and fall together. So I see a lot of evidence that if we get people eating higher welfare meat, that will also encourage vegetarianism rather than the competitive scenario. And I think we actually need to do some research. This is really what I came to, because what I want to say is I think there are large elements of the so-called kind of ethical or humane meat movement which are actually really hostile to vegetarianism. They don't say that explicitly, but there's kind of this notion that's really kind of a meat advocacy and then do it right on the back end. And I think that's a really serious thing to avoid. We think it's really important to say, as we work towards higher welfare animal farms, that there is another viable option and that many people really need to be adopting it if we're going to be successful, which is vegetarianism or veganism. So I don't take that as a small part of the solution. I think it's a big part. But my bet is that we can work for these high welfare farms and advance that at the same time. But I think the real answer is we need to do some studies, because this is a really serious question, and we need to find out, when we promote this kind of thing, does it make vegetarians go back to eating higher welfare meat, or does it in fact promote higher welfare, high ethical eating in general?
Cool. Thanks for the answer.
Thank you.
I talk to a lot of farmers who do like the whole small farm thing, and they have problems with the USDA. I was wondering if you're addressing that discrimination between the factory farms and the smaller farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is about addressing the way in which the USDA is often a kind of problem for small farmers. So the USDA is structured in such a way that it really supports factory farming. They don't really know what to do with small farmers like Frank. So the USDA comes to Frank's farm. They're like, where are your waste lagoons? Like the big, cesspool you saw there. And he's like, I don't have any waste lagoons. Like, but you're a chicken operation. And they literally don't know what to do. They don't even have that like a checkbox for how to investigate a farm like that. And that wasn't a problem per se, but of course in other cases, they really do create all sorts of problems. It is something we're working on. What we've mostly found is that what these small farmers need is kind of business or consulting services. They know how to farm, they know how to produce a product, but they don't know how to deal with government paperwork. They don't know how to put together a business plan. They don't know how to think in those ways. And so those are the services we've really been providing, not just to Frank, but to Kansas area farmers in general. And as we develop this model, And as we have more resources, the idea is precisely to make those services available.
Thank you for the talk and for your time. What are the major factors that keep high welfare farms from being cost competitive with factory farms? I mean, you mentioned that there was more losses in terms of animals dying if they're outside. And is it more labor intensive, and can automation drive that cost down?
Yeah, so the question is, what are the main factors that make high welfare farming more expensive than lower welfare farming? Just to first clarify what I said before, if we stick with the factory chicken genetics and we put those birds outside, it creates that problem. Of course, if we take traditional birds and we raise them outside, they're phenomenally healthy and have robust immune systems. There's two issues. There's one of scale. You know, what Frank is doing right now is expensive in part just because he's so small. If we can scale that up by demonstrating the effectiveness of his model, the costs will go down to an extent. The other factor is externalities. You currently have a factory farm industry which can cause hundreds of millions of dollars worth of pollution, create all sorts of injury issues for their workers and not pay them. So you've got all these externalized costs that aren't externalized in the high welfare farm. They're actually, they are polluting something, they're cleaning it up and so forth, a different kind of players. So if we can clean up the externalities, which is a legal issue, that would deal with the largest kind of chunk of it. And it's hard to calculate exactly how much those things cost for the reasons you can imagine. It's a complicated equation. But it will be more expensive. Meat is artificially cheap right now. We pay less for food of any kind than at any point in human history in terms of percentage of our income. It's incredibly small. I mean, we think food has gotten a little bit more expensive recently, but it's still historically at an all-time low. And so part of the solution here is to get us a little bit more comfortable spending a larger percentage of our income, whether we're wealthy or poor, but a larger percentage of our income on food and probably less higher quality meat.
Hi there. I used to work for a large environmental organization, and I was always amazed that animal agriculture really didn't make the list of things we talked about. We talked about a lot of other things, but as the number one cause of climate change, I felt like we were burying our heads in the sand when we didn't address it directly. And I guess it's not a really targeted question, but I would guess that if we could get the environmental community more behind animal agriculture, alternatives to current animal agriculture, that we'd see faster progress potentially. Do you have thoughts on why we haven't seen the environmental movement? Is it just that vegetarianism or eating meat is so personal that it's something they're scared to touch? I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. So the question is, why haven't environmental groups been more active fighting factory farming and talking about these diet issues? And yeah, a question of longstanding interest to me. It is one of the reasons I started the talk with talking about identity and the way in which it's bound up, because I think that's a huge part of it. There's something, with many environmental groups, there's a history of connection with hunting and preservation around that, which has become part of their ethos. But whether it's an environmental group or any other kind of group, for the most part, Americans kind of work within a frame in which, well, you have to eat meat. That's not a decision that's going to be negotiated or considered. It's kind of an unwritten law. The way you can kind of do this as a thought experiment is, could someone become president if they were a vegetarian? There's no law against a presidential candidate being a vegetarian, but honestly, what do you think would happen if we had a vegetarian? They'd be killed, no pun intended here. It's just completely unacceptable. And it's only really the animal movement which has gotten over that cultural barrier and is willing to say to people, maybe you shouldn't eat them at all, or you should eat less. It's happening in the environmental movement now. A few years ago, Sierra Club became the first to kind of have a big campaign against factory farms, and it does help a lot. And the Waterkeepers Alliance won some incredible lawsuits against pig factory farms and cost them $12 million in lawsuits. Unfortunately, the CEO of Smithfield at the time took a $12 million bonus, so it shows you how much that is a big fine. But the environmental groups are having an impact, and we are seeing progress there. But that's a cultural battle. And I think one of the most important things we can do is really just get people comfortable talking about meat as something optional, as something which maybe if it doesn't meet our values, we shouldn't be eating it. And if we do want to eat it, maybe we need to change the system. And that's a tough one and a very important one. Good question. Good question to end on.
Great. Please join me in thanking Aaron one more time for joining us at Google today.
Thank you.